Okay. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Data 101. This is a recorded presentation for the 2020 Special Populations Conference this year, or EdCamp as it has been renamed. Do a quick introduction for those of you who may not know me. My name is Jennifer Paul. I'm the English learner and the Accessibility Assessment Specialist in the Assessment Office at the Michigan Department of Education.
I'm Chad Bailey, also in the same office, but in the School Accountability Unit.
So we are here to introduce you to the WIDA assessment system and tell you a little bit about what type of data you can expect to get, how you can use it, and some of the questions that it might even be able to help you answer at the local level. So let's start by defining some terms, particularly if you're new. Sometimes the world of WIDA can be very confusing. So what is WIDA when we say it? Let's start with the WIDA consortium. When we talk about all the WIDA stuff, the WIDA standards, the WIDA assessments, all of these things are actually managed through the WIDA Assessment Consortium. And the WIDA Assessment Consortium is, as a whole, managed actually through the University of Wisconsin. Now, the WIDA assessments themselves are varied. There's not just one type of WIDA assessment. We have the WIDA screener assessments, we have the summative WIDA access for ELLs, and then we also have the WIDA alternate access for ELLs. So these are different things for different purposes. So when someone says the WIDA assessment, just keep in mind that there's more than one, and there's certainly more than one purpose of the WIDA assessments. Now, for the purposes of today's presentation, we are primarily going to be focusing on the summative WIDA access for ELLs assessment. So in order for us to understand the data coming from the WIDA access for ELLs assessment, we first need to just back up a step and make sure that we actually understand what we're assessing these students on. What is the basis for this actual assessment? So Michigan has adopted the connected WIDA English Language Development Standards on which the assessments are actually built. So just keep in mind also that the English Language Development Standards are actually different from English Language Arts Standards. They are two separate things. This again is a question that we get frequently from people who may not understand kind of what's going on in the world of English learners. And again, kind of related to this is the question pertaining to, so why in the heck are we making these kids take this test when they're already taking the M-STEP English Language Arts test, let's say? English proficiency standards or English language development standards are more related to the student's ability or proficiency that the student has in that particular language across 4 language domains. And in the case of WIDA, we are assessing our students in listening, reading, writing, and speaking. And there are corresponding English language development standards that go with those particular language areas. Content standards, again, thinking about our M-STEP English Language Arts assessment, the content standards are related to what a student needs to know about the, as I'm saying it, content that is being taught. So in the case of English Language Arts, the content is language arts and the language is English. Think for a second what Spanish language arts might look like. It would be language arts taught in Spanish. And for those of you who may know something about Spanish and its difference from English, there are different conventions, grammatical conventions. And so those are the types of things and differences that, that we're talking about when we think about English language proficiency versus English language arts as a content area. You may have also been wondering, why did we even choose this assessment? There could be other products that you know of. There are not many out there nationally, but there are others. So why did we even choose as a state to go with WIDA? So once upon a time, we were required, and we still are required, so this hasn't changed, but we were required at a certain point in time to actually switch to a set of standards that corresponded to English within the content area. We had to make sure that our English language proficiency assessment matched up in some ways and connected and tied back to our content areas. They needed to be connected in some way. And many years ago, we did not have that type of connection between our homegrown Michigan English Language Proficiency Assessment and our, at that time, it was MEEP, the good old days of MEEP. So we were required to do that, and the product at the time that would most easily allow us to make that federally, or to meet that federal requirement, was the WIDA assessments and the WIDA standards. So in 2013, WIDA, of course, as I mentioned, they were already producing an assessment that had a corresponding set of English language development standards. So in 2013, the Michigan Board of Education approved our state's adoption. So we've been using WIDA since that time. So as you think about looking backwards in time in data pertaining to WIDA, you would be able to go back to essentially to near that point in time. So what type of data will you actually get when you start thinking about looking at your WIDA Access for ELL scores? As I already mentioned, students will be assessed in listening, reading, writing, and speaking. Those are the content areas of the actual assessment. So you will get scores for those 4 areas. You get an additional 4 things as a part of that. You will get a comprehension score, an oral language score, a literacy score, and an overall proficiency level and score. So for each of these areas, it's not just one score. You're going to get actually a multitude of types of data here. You will get a scale score for each of these things. You'll have a corresponding confidence band, and you will also have a proficiency level in each one of these areas. No raw scores are available for this assessment. Raw scores without a connection to actual test questions that educators can review are not incredibly useful for understanding student performance. Imagine if you were to look at data that said a student got 5 out of 10 questions correct. That's not very helpful. What would be more helpful is if you could actually, as I mentioned here, if you knew what those questions looked like, what it is that they were actually testing, then you would be able to make a much more informed decision about the meaningfulness of that actual data. So this begs the question, again, this is a little bit more general assessment literacy here, but because we don't have raw scores, and as I mentioned, you're not going to have the ability to review questions, you may be asking yourself, well, but why not? Why can't I review these questions? So let's think about what our office's priorities are. And in general, most test vendors would prioritize these things as well. What are our priorities in ensuring that our tests work for teachers and educators? So our first is that we need to make sure that our tests are valid and reliable. We need to make sure that our tests are not overly burdensome for students, that they are as short as possible without compromising anything else in terms of what it is that we're trying to assess for our students. And we also need to make sure that our tests are secure. So these are the things that we're really trying to prioritize by not allowing for a release of summative test questions to the public. As we think more deeply about validity and reliability for our tests, let's again kind of have a better understanding of what that actually means related to why we can't distribute actual test questions to educators. So we have a certain number of test questions that have to be reused from year to year in order to create a stable and therefore meaningful set of test scores across years. The test question development process is actually quite lengthy, and it does stretch across multiple years of tryouts, essentially. So new test questions require a process that we call field testing. This essentially means that students answer questions that are being field tested, but the questions don't count ultimately towards their score. We do this to make sure that we're not giving scores to students if a question is bad. We want to take time to review the data afterwards to make sure that it is not unfairly biased, that it's not too difficult, that it's not too easy, etc. Oh, and I fortunately didn't cut myself off, but I gave away the answer on the next screen. So yes, field testing ensures all of these things as I was just mentioning. The downside to field testing means that it inherently makes your test longer. It does. There's no other way to get around this. We want to make sure that we are trying things out and being fair, but we also have this problem of, well, in order to continue to increase our pool of test questions, we continuously have to do field testing, which, like I said, it's just, the problem is it's just going to make the test longer. So that is related to reducing student burden, right? We can only make it so long. And our last area of security is something that is required actually through our peer review process through the US Department of Education. We are required as a part of ESSA to have a test that is secure. And part of that is we've got to be able to show that we've got appropriate security measures in place for our tests. And that means not releasing test questions, essentially. So if we don't release the test questions, then, and we don't reuse them, then we are absolutely able to meet the requirements, or some of the requirements for the test security pieces. There are many more pieces to security, but that would be part of it. So let's just really quickly think about two scenarios here. If we were to release questions with the intention that those questions could be reused, we're creating this security risk. Educators and students would have a greater opportunity to memorize the test questions or use them, or teachers could teach to them, etc. And this really would ultimately not make your test scores meaningful when you were to get them back potentially. The other scenario is we release the test questions with the intention that they would not be reused. So let's say we did that. We released them, but we know that we can't reuse them because that would create these other problems for us. It actually then creates a different set of problems for us. This essentially means that we are reducing our item pool. So you have a bank of test questions, and if you choose to start releasing them, then you are depleting and lowering your overall quantity of questions. This causes a reliability and validity issue because it could potentially lead to an inability to reuse those test questions that could create stability problems over the course of years of time. And then ultimately what would have to happen is, in order to replenish our pool of items, we have to increase field testing, which would overburden students potentially because we're making the test longer, or we would have to potentially give another test that's just field test questions to be able to expand and increase our item pool. So this is, again, a little bit, I wouldn't say it's off topic from understanding our data, but this is really about assessment literacy. And some of these concepts are not specific to WIDA. These are specific to kind of what happens across our, just generally across all of our summative assessments for the most part. So let's talk about let's return to our WIDA data and what type of data we can get, all right? I've already mentioned that you're going to get a score in these particular areas that you can see: listening, reading, writing, speaking. And then you've got these 4 areas that I mentioned that they're composite areas. So they are an amalgamation of multiple domains of scores. So our first one is oral language. That's a score a student will get that's made up of 50% listening, 50% speaking. You have literacy, which is 50% reading and 50% writing. Comprehension is 70% reading and 30% listening. And then your overall score is composed of all 4 domains, but the weighting is a little bit different. It's not 25, 25, 25, 25. It is 35% reading, 35% writing, 15% listening, and 15% speaking. So your data ranges that you will see when you look at reports or in the downloadable student data file, we're going to talk about those things later if these are new terms for you, but the data ranges that you will see look like this. They're very similar in some ways, and they kind of correspond to each other. You'll see in a second here. All of your scale scores will fall between 100 to 600. Your confidence bands will range from 100 to 600 also. And your proficiency levels will actually range from 1.0 to 6.0. And it is possible for students to get 1.2 and so on, 3.5, etc. They are not whole numbers. So how should you be interpreting these proficiency level scores as you look at them? Let's take an example. Our proficiency level scores, they are grade specific, meaning if you have a 5th grader who scored at proficiency level 4, they might earn a scale score of 355, okay? Now that same scale score of 355 for a 3rd grader might actually translate into a proficiency level score of 5.2. So that's an important thing that you need to know when you think about looking and comparing scores across grade levels. There is going to potentially be some difference, and this is, again, one thing that you want to keep in your mind as you're looking at your data. And in addition to being grade specific, they're also domain specific. So let's take again an example. You have a 6th grader who's scoring at proficiency level 4.3 in listening. They might have a scale score of 370. That same student who earns a scale score of 370 in reading might have a reading proficiency level of only 3.8 in that domain. Okay, so again, it's just, you got to keep this in mind when you're looking at your data. So what can you actually do with your proficiency level scores, keeping these things that I just pointed out in mind? You can make comparisons across domains, but the proficiency levels are not as useful for comparing across grades, okay? So you can do it within domains, but across grades, it's going to be very different for the examples that I just gave you. So an 8th grader, let's again take another example here because I like these examples. A 6th grader and an 8th grader do end up taking the same test. They take the grade 6 through 8 test. And in this example, they both earn a proficiency level score of 4.0. This is because the result of the 8th grader earning a higher scale score, okay? So the 8th grader essentially must perform better than the 6th grader to earn the same proficiency level score because the proficiency level is grade specific. Okay? And that kind of makes sense when you think about it. The expectations are going to go up across the grades. All right, let's talk scale scores next. Your scale scores are actually a really great data point to look at. Proficiency levels are nice, but scale scores are even better because they are able to take into account differences in item difficulty, and they place the K-12 students on a single continuum. What this allows you to do is track growth over time, and Chad's going to talk a little bit about growth here in a little while. However, when you look at especially when you look at your scale scores, it's important to note that you shouldn't be comparing scale scores from or before 2016-17 to scores like today, okay? That's because a standard setting occurred at that time. So what that means is that something changed, okay? A big something kind of changed, and we're not able to make those comparisons. So the definition of a standard setting, if you haven't heard this term before, a standard setting is essentially a process through which student performance on an assessment is determined by a series of decisions made by panels of educators. So they sit down and they look at questions and proficiency levels and scale scores and try to look at how a student, what are the student's expectations across each one of those areas. And so it's always good practice when these large scale changes happen with an assessment or an accountability system to go through a standard setting process so that we can make sure that the results actually reflect what we want them to. All right, confidence bands. This is something that you will see alongside your scale scores, and your actual scale score that you get on the report, that's just one point within this confidence band that is displayed on the little charts on the reports themselves. The confidence band is the standard error of measurement. What this does is just takes into account the possible student performance variations. We all know that it's going to happen because it's a point in time assessment. Students may be sick that day when they're testing. They may have had a fight with mom and dad in the morning before they went off to school. So they're in a really bad mood and they're just not going to perform well today. Or, I mean, you can insert any other reason, right, for why student performance might vary day to day. The confidence band just ensures that you have a perspective on what that variation might look like, right? So the narrower the confidence band, the more reliable the test results actually are. And I'm going to turn it over to Chad right now to talk with all of you about growth.
Okay, so in addition to our status or achievement scores, so proficiency levels and scaled scores, in the state of Michigan, we can also get growth scores. Michigan uses the student growth percentile model, which is a normative model, which means we're placing the students' outcome in context of students with similar prior achievement scores or their scale scores. So the scores range from 1 to 99, so they're common percentile scale, and by definition, average is 50. So a percentile, remember, is what percent of students are below that score. And so by definition, half of all the students have to be in the bottom half. Half of all the students have to be in the top half. So 50 becomes the default average. So a growth score of 70 would be interpreted as 70% of students who had similar prior scale score histories ended up with lower performance than that student. So on the end test in the current year, 70% of similar students had lower scores. So this allows us to start placing students in, did they have, as they're progressing through the test year to year, are they having below average, average, or above average growth or progress? And that begins to help us kind of look at what is normal, are they a little behind, are they right on track, are they a little ahead? The separate part, but if the next question is it enough growth? Are they on track to reach proficiency? Well, then you can't really have the question of what's average or typical. You have to have a question of what is necessary. And that's where we get growth targets that say, here's the growth score that's needed to put a student on path to reach or maintain English proficiency. And so that's going to vary by where the student starts. So for a student who is at a low PL1, so maybe a 1.2, the amount of growth they need to achieve to get on track to proficiency is much higher than a student who is, say, at a 4.2. If our exit point is now a 4.8, that's our cut point for proficiency, you can see a 4.2 is much closer. So they have to grow near as fast to reach that 4.8. Whereas a student down at that 1.2 really has to chuck it to catch up to that 4.8. They need to progress very fast. And so that's where growth score describes kind of where they are. Growth target describes where they need to be. Jen, can you go to the next slide? That's back to Jen.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about aggregate data. So you've now gotten a perspective on the individual student data that you can get. Chad has talked about growth, but you're also going to get some aggregate data from WIDA in the reports that you'll actually receive from them. You are going to get the student roster report. This essentially puts together a group of students in a single grade and school. So this is really helpful for identifying patterns in student performance. And these patterns can help in making instructional program decisions. So at the large level, they can make program decisions. You'll also get a frequency report. This is available at the school and district level. This is going to give you the number of test takers, the percentages of the population attaining certain scores. So again, in a very similar way, you can use this to identify areas of need based on student performance. It's possible that you might see, let's say at the district level, you might see that your students are all performing at the low end in writing, let's say. Well, that may be impetus for you then to focus on writing at the district level as a whole. Or perhaps when you look at these frequency reports, you'll see that maybe one building is doing particularly well in that domain and other buildings are not. So what is that building doing, and what could you do potentially to replicate what they're doing across buildings? And again, this is really just to be used for identifying those areas of need potentially, or highlighting areas where students are doing well at the local, at the district level and local level being the building level. So important points to keep in mind as we talk about all of this data and the types of data that you're going to get. The results of this summative assessment are not intended to provide a school or district with the ability to manage day-to-day classroom instructional changes. We all know that our summative assessments, because you don't get them back immediately, they can't be used for making more expeditious and more daily, as I mentioned, classroom instructional changes, just because of the timing of when you get results. This is not specific to WIDA. This is certainly something that happens with MSTEP, with our PSAT, etc. And to that point, keep in mind that, again, it's a summative test. It's a point-in-time assessment. It's designed to meet federal requirements which are intended to ensure that schools are providing English language development support for students. It's really designed for making those large, overarching program decisions for our students.
And so as we get to our data and we start to grab our data, there are some really common questions that district EL program people and testing coordinators often have to answer with district leadership. Two of those questions are, why are our ELs performing so bad on WIDA? Why is so low a percent of students proficient on WIDA? And given that very low proficiency rates, what would justify your request for additional staff members? It often seems to be occurring within EL programs. So the first point, the important point to focus on is ELs by definition are still learning English. They don't know English. The question is not so much of do they know it or not, it's for the most part, to what degree do they not know English? How much do they not know? And so that we can tailor the instruction around that. The research shows it takes on average 5 to 7 years. So for a given student, they're going to show is not EL proficient 4 times on average before they actually, the 5th time, they might get there. Again, that's an average. Some kids achieve it much closer, much quicker, some much longer, but it's very common. The other part to look at is look at those growth scores, not just achievement. So yes, you might not have a lot of kids that are across the proficiency line at that 4.8, but are they growing? So do you have a kid who, yes, they were at PL 2.0, but their growth score is at the 90th percentile. And so yes, they're chucking way above, they're growing way faster than similar students. Yes, they're further behind, but they're making very quick progress. And that should be celebrated even though the student hasn't crossed that goal of proficiency yet. Then the other really important part to help those district leaders is to put in the context of state, ISD, and the district, and the building. So in 1819, the statewide average was less than 20% of students meeting EL proficiency. So that gives a great context when, you know, a district leader might be saying, we only have 22% of our ELs are proficient on WIDA. We can actually say, that's actually above state average in that year. And so that helps give a context of, okay, our program is not awful. This is just a very challenging thing, and it takes time. These students work through the scale. It's not, we work really hard, and in 1 year, we jump across the scale. It takes multiple years. And these come into play then when you're talking about extra staff members. So it's really important to look at the count of students at each proficiency level. Proficiency levels, by and large, are a way to describe the degree of student need. So students who are at higher proficiency levels, their need is less intense. They're closer to achieving English proficiency, and they need supports, but it's not the same type of intensive supports a student down at PL1 would need. Those students are really struggling. They may have zero exposure to English, and they're starting to learn what are the sounds and the phonemes used in English, what are the structures of the language. Those students have much more intense needs. And so if you have a lot of your kids down in the PL1, PL2 range, there's a lot of need in your district, in your school. And that can actually be a very loud signal to administrators. I actually need more staff. My students are really struggling, and I need more staff to help support that need. The other point of context can be looking at growth scores grouped by those proficiency levels. So for my kids who are in PL1, what do their growth look like? Are they really progressing very fast, and therefore I may not be very worried? They were far behind, but they're making very quick progress. Versus if they're very far behind in a performance level 1, and their growth scores are all very, very low, say maybe growth scores of 20, then I'm very concerned because those students are falling, they are behind and they're not making progress, they're falling further behind. Versus, you know, if that same group of PL1 kids are off in the growth scores of 90 or 80, that's a much more encouraging outcome. And so it helps to look through on how is our program performing. So next slide, Jen. And so as we cover through those, that brings us to, okay, now I understand some of the data we can get. We can get proficiency, proficiency levels, scale scores, growth scores. Those are things that exist. Now the question is, where do I go to get them? And the answer is we have multiple locations. It depends on part with the timing, part with the score. Excuse me. So one of the places is WIDA AMS. That's our testing and vendors secure portal. And that gets you your earliest set of reports, and those are all focused on your achievement. So your proficiency levels, your scaled scores, those become earliest available in WIDA AMS. There's also the OEA secure site, which is an in-house Michigan Department of Ed secure portal used for all of our assessments. So WIDA, MSTEP, PSAT, SAT, and all the rest of state assessments, the test administration and the scores are all available in the secure site across time for the student. My School Data, which is more of a public portal where it has a public side where you can get public aggregates on the various levels from the statewide to the ISD, district, building, and grade, as well as there's a secure portion where counts are unsuppressed on My School Data. And then MyLearn, which is the newest kind of way to get data, which takes the most upfront work. It does. It takes more work to set up. But once you do, the data is very much in the control of the district on how to manage who has access to the data and to give the broadest audience and the less hurdles for teachers and other administrators that need access to that to gain access to relevant data. So a really great way to help kind of give much more detail and to summarize that is the English Learner Data Sources Catalog, which we posted out at the EL webpage for Michigan Department of Ed. So that's posted at www.mi.gov/MDE-EL under the, and we're going to go out there. So Jen, if you can click on that link, we're going to show you that document quickly. Hopefully that opens. You can share out. Apologize for the little bit here as we transition over. And so that first link under the EL accountability and data on that website. And so as we're here, this document does a quick, this first page kind of shows you what the data source is. It groups them by public or secure access. So can you get them with or without a login? So public means you don't have to have a login to get to it. Secure would mean you have to have a login credential. There's a process to say, go talk to somebody who's an administrator and say, yes, you have access, and they approve that access. Aggregate is whether that's at an account level or per student, which is the individual student's records. And so then we list out the data sources, and across the top to the right, you'll see the checks and X's to determine for is the data available at the district level or at the school level. And then when you're doing that in the aggregates, there's always what we call a minimum count. So to protect student privacy, we won't show groups of students below certain counts. And the common breakpoints are often 10 or 30. And once you drop below those counts, then we'll say you have to have a secure login really to see that. And you see this primarily with things like up on that public side, you'll see it's 10 or 30 often. Once you get to that secure portal, you'll notice most of them will have access once you get behind a secure login. The rest of the document kind of goes through and will list each of the data sources. It'll give a description of what's available in that data source. It then gives you the location of how do I access that data source? Where do I go to find it? And the click path to get there, as well as it provides the support contact, either the email and or phone for the people that are charged with managing that system. So if you're like, I really want to find an EL dashboard and I found something and I'm really struggling, where do I go for questions? Well, then you would go to mde-oea@michigan.gov, and that question will be routed and make sure that the appropriate contact can provide you answer that question. And that goes through for the public aggregates, for the secure aggregates, the secure student. Each of those follow that same form. And at the very end of this document, so down on page 7, we get to, it's a new section of this document, which was added this year, which is how do I get access, or how do I request access to the secure data sources? So for WIDA Secure Site, WIDA AMS, the secure side of My School Data, and MyLearn, all those take prior approval. So how do I go request that prior approval? And that is a key point, is a request for access. You might be denied. The administrator might look at it and say, you really don't have a need. So this is not to say you want access, you instantly go here and it's automatically get it. It takes approval, and for those records, those are on a need to have basis. And so the administrator is trained on how to determine that, and they'll go through there. The one, again, that takes the most process is MyLearn. You first have to have the district opt in to data hubs and then opt into MyLearn. But once that happens, then the district controls the individual teachers or program people that can have access. And that is truly the easiest way, once it's set up, those people get their data. Secure Site is up at the state level and again requires some approval. AMS is done through Secure Site, and My School Data is done by the ISTs. So each of those links will take you where to go to kind of find information and lead through how to request that data. And so that's kind of where that data sources catalog will help you remember what's available on what site, where do I go to find it, if I have questions, where do I go to get those questions answered, and if I'm just setting up access to those accounts, those secure accounts, how do I do that? This kind of answers all those questions. And so then we can go back to the slides. And we'll jump back into our connect back through. And it's going to jump. And as we get back in, just as a connection back to the slide deck, this is again just kind of the links to where do I go to begin requesting access for those secure sites. Whether it's OES Secure Site, WIDA AMS, My School Data, or MyLearn, how do I request access for that? And so you can both go to the catalog as well as here in the slide deck, it gives the initial links.
So what do we want out of today's presentation? We really want to, or wanted, and still want to help build on your knowledge about your EL data, what it means, what it can do for you. Start thinking more deeply about the needs of your ELs in your work that you're doing. And we do also want to collaborate with you. You might not believe that because we're at the state, but we actually do. We want to hear from you. We want to hear how you're using the data. Even asking us questions helps us develop new resources, new tools for everybody out in the field. So please let us know when you have ideas, thoughts, or questions about anything. And how do you do that? You can do that by emailing Chad or myself. My email address is paulj@michigan.gov. Chad's address is baileyc5@michigan.gov. And we hope you enjoyed today's presentation and that you will find it valuable in the upcoming year's work. So good luck to everyone in the school year, and we will talk to you again sometime soon. Thank you.